Let's unravel some mysteries here. All right, here we go. So I think we're gonna skip this. Right. So are there some areas where kids do better? What lessons can we learn from them? So recent studies have used big data to measure how upward mobility varies based on where children grow up. So there's a couple key features here, right? So we've got census data connected up with taxes returns, and we've got birth cohorts from 78 to 83, 20 million children, 96% coverage of America. Right? So here we go, blah, blah, blah. This is it. So if you grew up in a what is this? Let's say you're 10%, right? So you're a bottom 10%er as a child, right? Going up, you end up at about 36, right? On average. So you don't break the median, but you move up. And if you grow up in a 90%er, you end up at 63, right? So everybody kind of moves towards the center, but it's not flat, right? So it's not irrelevant how much money you had growing up. It's relevant, but it's not a perfect straight line, right? A 1% person doesn't turn to 1, and 30 to 30, and 90 to 90. You tend to move towards the middle. Right? And there's that trend there. But you can imagine, right? So the slope of this line says something about the country, right? So the flatter the slope, the more in effect, the more income mobility we have, right? Because your childhood income ranking will have little bearing on your adulthood income rating if this was flat. Obviously, it's not. Okay. So, and this is for America, this is for a census tract. And you can see it still works for individual census tracts, but there's more like variability, right? There's more uncertainty once you have less data, right? So this is just a picture. Again, this is growing up poor. So this is earning $27,000. Okay, and that's household income, right? That's important. So if you have a household income of $27,000, are you in poverty? I think basically, right? You're pretty close to it, right? And you can see there's huge differences, right? If I grow up with parents with a household earning 27 as an adult, right? If I grew up in Dubuque, I make 45. If I grew up in Cleveland, I make 29, regardless of where I live now, right? And this sort of speaks to what we saw. There's some big differences there. Salt Lake 37, LA 34, San Francisco 37.
It doesn't really give you cost of living, like.
No, all right. So that's a good question,
so
right?
It may not be upwardly mobile.
Got it. So if I grew up in Atlanta, if I tend to live in places that are cheap to live,
right,
that would affect that. Yeah.
Right.
So if you grew up in Dubuque and your parents earn $27,000, you have the opportunity to make 45.
On average, you make 45.
And you're worse off in San Francisco at 37,000.
But that, right? Don't forget, you're not necessarily in San Francisco, but you could be on average, right?
Oh, that's.
But you could grow up in San Francisco, move to Nebraska, still make the 37.
It's where you grew up, not where you are.
Right. But, right, you do make a good point. If I grew up in San Francisco, I'm more likely to live in San Francisco, and now I'm hurting, right? I'm homeless.
You're homeless for 37,000.
Right. All I can do is buy my bagels, that's it. So, that's sort of a question. But, right, it'd be pretty hard to argue that I grew up in Dubuque, and I stayed in Dubuque, and Dubuque is super expensive, and that's why this is working. Because that's not really true.
That's not
true. Right, Dubuque is not.
Right.
Yeah. So San Francisco, maybe you can make that argument, but you can't for Dubuque. And not really for Salt Lake either. And maybe you can for Atlanta and backwards, right? So I don't know that Atlanta's that cheap, though, right? I mean, compared to San Francisco, it is, but. So there are big differeces, right? There are big differences. So, and we saw that too, right? So the question is, what's driving those differences? So there's two questions, right? So number one, do people go, right? Do different people live in different places, right? So if I'm an incredibly effective human being, I naturally gravitate to Iowa. And if I'm just a loser, I naturally gravitate to Atlanta because Atlanta is attracted to losers. Okay, so That's a possibility, right? That would work. That would do that, right? Not particularly compelling, although I think it matters a little, right? But also, right, that maybe the places where people grow up have a causal effect on mobility for a person, right? The fact that I grew up in Iowa versus growing up in Reno affects my adulthood, and I get different outcomes.
Right, if you grew up in rural America and you're poor, you're probably going to try to get the heck out of there and move place so you can make some money elsewhere, potentially.
Okay, right, and
If you grew up in a big city,
yep. Okay, let's run with that explanation. So if I look here, right, is this a map of urban versus rural? Right, are the blue regions rural and the red regions urban?
no.
Not really. A little, right? But there's
Heavy
plenty,
population
right?
south.
There's plenty of rural here, right?
Yep.
Right? And there's plenty of urban, Salt Lake, Texas. Boston's pretty urban.
Yep.
New York. So, but I think the point is, so maybe I think you're right. There's a little bit to that. It's not going to explain it all, though.
No.
Right? There's other things going on than just that. So the question is what, right? So, couple things we can do. Like, obviously, you can look at people who moved and see if moving does things, because then we know, right? And this is interesting, right? So this is just an example. See, these are two neighborhoods that are both around. Oh gosh, we're in Massachusetts. I think these are two different cities in Massachusetts. Growing up in Roxbury is bad. Growing up in Savin Hill is good, right? So the question is, if I move from Roxbury to Savin Hill as a 2-year-old, I spent a whole bunch of time in Savin Hill, and I should get good outcomes, right? And if I move to Savin Hill as a 17-year-old or a 22-year-old, how much is it going to help? Maybe not much, right? So we would expect, if the neighborhood actually matters, right, the longer you lived there, the bigger the effect, right? If that really matters, right? And that wouldn't be a selection thing, because why would people who move to Savin Hill with 6-year-olds be that different from people who move to Savin Hill with 11-year-olds? Right? Everybody's moving there, so it's possible, right, that there's a huge difference between those people, but that's not, like, the whole selection thing is probably not so likely. So if we push down, there you go, right? So what do you see? You see the longer I'm, exposed to Savin Hill, the better I do, right? So if I move there as, a 20-year-old, it does, almost nothing, right? But if I move there as a 2-year-old, it's like I am been there forever, right? And everything in between. Okay, and then, right, the difference between a 23-year-old and a 28-year-old is, right, it just doesn't matter, right? At that point, whatever your life patterns are set. Yep. So basically, you're going to bring Roxbury with you wherever you go. And right, this makes sense to me, right? When I moved to San Diego, everybody wanted they would get these F-350 extra long bed Super Duty dually trucks and put them 1 inch off the ground. And I thought that was the dumbest thing in the world, right? And living in San Diego didn't make me want to drive one of those, right? But I bet if I moved there when I was 5, oh yeah, I'd want a Baja Bug and a lower dually and all the crazy wacky stuff San Diegans thinks are awesome, right? And if a San Diegan came to Wisconsin, right, are they gonna, right? Or right? Are they gonna be really motivated to be on a nonprofit board to tell their friends? No. Right? So again, this is then there's other ways. This is some of the details about how you're careful to make sure this is actually working. And here we go. So here's a fun little thing. So these are all these different large metropolitan areas, right? And so one can think, right? You can guess, right? Do areas with lots of good job opportunities and job growth, are those the kind of areas that are good to grow up in poverty? Right? Do you want to be poor in a town with lots of economic opportunity, or do you want to be poor in a town with terrible economic opportunity? Growing up. Okay, ready? If that were true, right? If I put a grid, right, here is, right, lots of opportunity. Let's see. Hold on. Well, let's look at it. Because now I got to remember. Right, so this is, okay, so this is lots of job growth and lots of opportunity for people in poverty, right? And this is lots of job growth, terrible job growth and lots of opportunity for people in poverty. And right, so if your story was true, which of these squares is filled out of these four? Where are the cities? Right? If what you said is accurate, income mobility should follow job growth, right? So there should be a bunch of cities in this square and a bunch of cities in this square and nothing here and nothing here, right? Like Detroit, terrible for mobility, terrible for job growth. It's just terrible, right? Houston, lots of economic opportunity, lots of mobility, right? Those fit what you're talking about. Reality is though, right? There are lots of cities that don't fit that mold, right? So Charlotte and Atlanta, tons of economic opportunities, lots of job growth, bad place to grow up in poverty. Right? San Jose, fantastic place to grow up in poverty, terrible job growth. Right? So these things don't, right? And this is basically a blob. Right? So awesome economic opportunities are not the same. Oh, I should plug in. I have my cord. Yikes. Sorry. I didn't realize I hadn't. Okay, here we go. Oh, no plugs. There it is. Okay. So, right, these are different things, right? So the question is, what's, you can say, well, what's going on with these cities that have awesome economic opportunities and are terrible at bringing people out of poverty, like Charlotte and Atlanta? Okay. So let's just do this together. What do Denver, Houston, Sacramento, Seattle, Minneapolis, San Francisco, San Jose have that Atlanta, Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland, and Charlotte don't? Let's just talk about it together. Let's get some ideas. What's true in the top that's not true in the bottom? Income inequality. So we think that Detroit and Atlanta have lots of income inequality, and that Minneapolis and Sacramento maybe don't.
Less.
Okay, possible. Should we write that down? Should we write it down? Income inequality. Any other ideas?
Okay, so most of those on the top are on the west coast-ish. Whereas the other ones are in older cities in the US.
Oh, this is a good question, like old versus young, maybe?
Well, different things that happen with older cities, like Atlanta's the south, and Charlotte's also. Those other three are big.
Besides Detroit.
Right, Detroit, Baltimore, and Cleveland are all industrial type older cities.
So let's do the ethnic question. Is there an ethnic diversity difference
Yeah,
between the top
that's what
one?
I was thinking.
Well, so where's the diverse and where's the not diverse?
It's not. What do you mean diverse?
Well, that's a good question. So, for example, I know for a fact that Sacramento is very ethnically diverse, right?
Yes, it is.
Houston is fairly ethnically diverse, right? So is Detroit and Atlanta.
Yeah, but they're more segregated in those places, whereas in
Okay, so you're saying,
like in
so maybe there's a ton of races in all these places, but that maybe the segregation is different between them?
well, not segregation so much as you can go through neighborhoods and they're not going to be neighborhoods like they are in Atlanta, Detroit, Cleveland. Like
So-
my husband's family's from Cleveland. And
Sure.
All the Croatian and Slovenians live in, he's Slovenian and Croatian, so that's where they all live there.
So, okay, got it. So we got ethnic diversity everywhere, but maybe there's ethnic neighborhoods in the bottom line and not as much in the top.
Right.
When I think of those top ones, I think of more technically advanced type cities, like you think of Seattle and Microsoft, and
Oh, yeah.
a
Technology.
lot of those up there have like Amazon warehouses on the top.
Progressive.
Yeah. That's interesting too.
I don't know that I would describe Houston as. I mean,
Houston's the anomaly of all of those. Well, Houston
Well,
likes to
except for the
eat, that's what they do
segregation
well.
thing.
well, okay, right. I guess if we're doing like the Democrat Republican thing. Now, don't forget, right, at least nowadays, basically all large urban centers are Democratic almost totally, right? So you're going to be right, like Atlanta, Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland are all fairly Democratic too, right? I don't know about Charlotte. Charlotte might not be, but
I wasn't referring politically though, more like they're more innovative centers on the top. There's new
More
things.
technology centers.
yeah. Okay, sure.
Hit the market.
Oh, got it. Economically progressive.
Right, right.
Maybe the types of jobs that are.
Oh yeah, job
That's
types maybe.
what I was thinking about that kind of.
Yep. Okay, good. Are we happy? Are we gonna sit, or do you want to add one?
No, mine was that's what I was trying to get to when I was saying that segregation. The way that they live in those other bottom cities is people have different jobs in different areas of those cities that it's clearly delineated who lives where.
Well, that's like Detroit. That's the famous 8 Mile, right? I mean,
Right.
there's like the road, and
Yeah.
if you're black, you live south of it, and you're
Yes.
white, you live north of it, and
Yes.
that's it.
And they have attitudes that are like that too. Oh, as long as you stay past the 1300 block of such and such, you'll be okay. I'm like, well, do the bullets make that same decision? I mean, do they just go, oh, 1300 block, I'm good.
Right. Okay. Good. Stick with this. Okay. We got our brainstorming. See where we got. Okay. Here's the big reveal. Right. Again, we have our Reno story, our Winona story, our Prior Lake story. What are the ingredients that make things shine or stink? Sorry. Right? What works and what doesn't for the right? What are the things that? What are the things these cities have? Right. So this is right now. We don't have time to explain how we come to this determination. Right. It's an intense economic research data process, but I can at least give you the result. Right. So what's the result? The 5 strongest things related to upward mobility. Number 1, segregation. Right. So if you are a highly ethnically segregated city, that is not good, right? So here's Atlanta. You can see, right? Green, you're black. Red, you're Asian. Blue, you're white. And Hispanic, you're orange. You can see, right? Nobody's mixing. Not really, right?
Wow.
So this is a very, very segregated city. This is now Sacramento. Right? Now, there are, of course, tendencies, but you can see in Sacramento, there is a lot more ethnic mixing going on. Right? So, statistically speaking, you do much better with income upward mobility if you live in a city, right? If you're in poverty, you want to live in a city like this and not in a city like that. Right? Okay, so that's a big one. And let's think about this, right? So, and I don't know the answer for Reno, but is Winona ethnically segregated?
Yeah.
Okay. Prior Lake? Okay. Reno? Probably. Okay. Here we go. It's already up there. We got it right. Ding, ding, ding. Income inequality, right? Places with the smaller middle class have much less mobility. And right, that's a fact. We could speculate as to why, and we're not going to. You can probably come up with some theory, right? But empirically, we know this is true, right? So the cities that that list on the top, they have less income inequality than the list on the bottom. School quality. Okay, maybe no surprise there. Schools are an investment in kids. Kids that are invested in end up doing well, on average. Right? And spending more money, smaller classes, higher test scores. Okay, so Right, and that's a whole different separate thing where you can say, oh, well, there's some school districts where they don't spend very much money, but they still get great outcomes. Fine, but we're just talking about averages here, right? So not every school district can take, pennies and turn it to diamonds, right? Maybe somebody can, but on average, that's not what's going to happen. So if you look on average, money is just, on average, more money is better outcomes on average, right? So sometimes you can spend it on stupid things, like, now, I was about to say giant football stadiums, but we know that football teaches social skills, blah, blah, blah. So, anyway. Okay, segregation, income inequality, social school quality, family structure. So, it's important. Oh, and I forgot to give my little speech, right? So, at this, if you're trying to ascribe political motivations to stuff I say in class, I'm going to look like a very schizophrenic, like political pundit, because... right? At times I'll look like a social conservative, and then you know what I mean? Like, this is basically just what the data says. It's just the truth. And sometimes the truth looks very Republican, and sometimes the truth looks very Democrat, right? So we just charge forward and don't worry about whose bees we're going to get in the bottom. Okay. So in this case, areas with single parents have much lower income mobility, right? It's not good. And this is even crazy, right? If your own parents were married and stay married, so you grew up with two stable, married entire time parents, if the neighborhood has a bunch of single parents, you're still in trouble, right? So you need a neighborhood full of people modeling stable marriages to get it to work. And lastly, social capital. So that one's a little more complicated, but you can sort of imagine, based on what it says. Those are the 5 big ones, right? So it'd be interesting. So this is what you want, sort of your next step to go back and think about your own thing and to say, okay, well, in Winona, which of these do we have and which of these don't we, right? And a lot of that data is in that website, right? You can look at, percent married and, how good the schools are and stuff. Mm-hmm. But right, this is important though, right? There are probably a lot of other things that also make sense that are not in this list, right? So, right, I don't see anywhere on here poverty, right? So it doesn't matter if you live in a neighborhood with poverty, right? If you're in poverty in a neighborhood in poverty, that's okay as long as it has, ethnically diverse, low-income inequality with stable family structure, right? And I think I saw that in Arizona, right? Because you had, right, especially if you're Hispanic in Arizona, a lot of times you don't speak very much English, or you don't have a ton of income earning potential, but there was a lot of mixing and a lot of stable family structure. And so, now I guess Arizona is not great on the data, so maybe I'm telling bad stories, but, right, it's, the fact that people are, so being poor isn't on this list. But, going to bad schools in a single parent household with no social capital in a segregated area, right, is probably also related to poverty. But that's what gets you. Okay. So what do we do, right? So if this is, right, so this is where people do well. Let's think about like social solution kind of stuff. So let's imagine you've got a kid and they're growing up in an environment that's all of these bad things, right? We've got segregation, we've got income inequality, we've got low school quality, unstable family structure in the neighborhood, low social capital. Like, what can we do to help this kid?
Well, move them out of there at a very young age, and your chances are better, correct?
Yes, okay. Move them out of there at a very young age, right? And where, yeah, okay, and where do we move them to?
Very high income neighborhood.
Very good, okay. All right, and let's think about this, right? How would we do that? Because they can't afford to live in the high income neighborhood, right?
There's low income housing in
busing.
high income neighborhoods.
Okay, so we could build some housing in the high income neighborhood. Busing, right?
Yeah, but
Yep.
incentives or something.
Okay, and talk to me about incentives. Yep.
Low interest rates.
Okay, sure. So we're gonna talk about what actually happened. So this is a real federal program, right? So if you're really poor, you have a family with kids that's in poverty, right? You can get federal housing assistance, or how does it look? So it looks like monetary support for you to live, right? Basically, they just subsidize your rent, right? Section 8 kind of stuff, right? They subsidize your rent, and that means you're more able to afford housing in a place maybe you couldn't otherwise, right? It doesn't necessarily follow, right, that the neighborhoods that have all these things are expensive. That's us assuming. That's kind of us projecting. That's not true. I mean, it's you'll see in the data, it's like a trendish, but it's not very strong. So it's like, okay, in general, as your rent goes up, these qualities tend to go up, but there's plenty of very expensive neighborhoods that are terrible on these metrics, and there's plenty of affordable neighborhoods that are really great. This is what happened. But actually, this is even more interesting. So again, we want people to live in neighborhoods like this, right? So what happened was for 4,600 families during this time period, you randomly got assigned to either you don't get no vouchers, you just are in public housing, right? Or, right, so this is like projects, right? So you're in a project, everybody around you is qualifies for federal housing assistance. So everybody is very poor in your entire building, right? But if you get the Section 8 housing, you got to get out of the public housing, get out into a regular neighborhood of your choosing with some financial support. Okay, that was group 2. And then group 1 was the special experimental one. You were given the vouchers, but you had to move to a top 10%er neighborhood, right? They forced you to move into a wealthy neighborhood. You couldn't stay, or you couldn't move into like a townhome in your bad neighborhood. Bad. You had to move into, the other one. Okay? So what do you think's going to happen? What's happening here? You're a kid, you grow up in the public housing, what happens? Right? You grew up in poverty, what happens? You stay in poverty, right? Now, what if you got this voucher?
Some movement.
A little bit of movement? And if you got this one? Stronger, right? So that's this thing. And this is what it looks like in New York, right? So Harlem Towers is the public housing, right? You get like these big skyscraper kind of things. You've seen them, right? So Section 8, you ended up in the Bronx. And if you got the special experimental one, you're way up in Wakefield. Also in the Bronx, but over here, right? That's not what always happened, but it's examples, right? So what do you get? So if you grew up in the projects, you're making $11,000, right? Not great. At age, what is this? Oh, this is you're a little kid, right? So if you're a little kid, by the time you're 24, you have annual earnings of $11,000 or $13,000, or in the special thing, about 15, right? This P is the probability that this difference was like a random artifact of the data, approximately. And so this is a 1.5% chance that this is an accident, right? So this is a strong effect, right? More income from the experimental group. This is college attendance, or you're more likely to attend college if you're in the experimental group, right? If you weren't adjusted, you were 23% chance of living in poverty. This declines, right? As you're forced, right? You're basically forced out of the neighborhood by incentives. And then the neighborhood single motherhood number is lower. So this is if you were an older teenager, right? What happened? In fact, it was worse, right? So if you stayed in the projects, you were better than being forced into these other neighborhoods, right? And if you were a teenager and you were forced into the top 10% neighborhood, you were in fact much more likely to be a single mother, right? Or to be in a neighborhood with single mothers, I think is what that is, right? So So this is the problem, right? The people who did the project, this is the data that came in first, right? So they did all these vouchers and said, wow, we actually made things worse, right? Because that's the first data that came in. They followed the kids and said, oh my gosh, everything's bad, right? But then you go back and revisit it later, and the kids that moved as little kids did really well, right? So that really speaks to the, to like the neighborhood aspect of it, right? Because if it's affecting little kids but not teenagers, it would make sense if the neighborhood is having an effect on kids who could absorb it, I guess. Yep. So, and this is true all over, right? So the little kid versus older kid effect. This is the U.S. This is Australia. That's Canada. This is Denmark. Some major cities. This is when you blew up Chicago public housing. You got this big, right? It had a big positive effect on little kids and barely any effect on the older kids. So yeah. All right, so here's the question. We'll in like 3 minutes, and then we'll go. Right, so if we think about, if I have Section 8, right, I can go wherever I want. Where do I go in terms of upward income mobility, right? It's up to me. What kind of neighborhoods am I choosing to go to?
Less expensive.
Probably. And therefore, not necessarily therefore, but you'll see. Here we go. So the black, right? The black dots are where people with Section 8 vouchers choose to live. You can see, right? Where are they showing up? All over, like they found all the red in Seattle, right? There's all this stuff blue everywhere else, right? And the dot, it's even, like if you zoom in on, right? Look at this. So this is like all the different places where people are using their vouchers. And right, they're very heavily concentrated in the red parts of the city, right? Nobody's here, nobody's here, nobody's here.
Because that's where they build Section 8 housing.
Well, yeah.
The real estate is cheaper.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be, right? I guess maybe, now I'm treading into territory I don't know a ton about, but I don't think you need, right? You can do Section 8 with like a regular house too, right? If the landlord allows it.
Right.
It's certified and stuff.
Yeah.
That's true. But economically, you wouldn't do that unless you were trying to get above market, or a different rent level.
Okay, so I totally believe that landlords are more willing to supply Section 8 housing in these kind of red neighborhoods, right?
You're gonna get more in Section 8 in a red neighborhood than you're gonna get on a non-Section 8 in that same neighborhood. You wouldn't you'd get a low NOI buying real estate in a dark blue neighborhood and trying to make that profitable with Section 8 rents.
Well, as a,
Well, you gotta be a landlord that's wanting to accept Section 8. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
as a slumlord,
Yep.
I'll say something about land barrenness, is that one of the things that benefits Section 8 is not that you're trying to get more money or less money out of the housing voucher. It's that you have a guaranteed income and they will definitely pay the rent. It's different than when you're interviewing someone to use that. However, in certain neighborhoods, there's a social component that makes it so you wouldn't offer your property to Section 8 housing. Not that you couldn't, but that you wouldn't, because it would really make the neighbors.
But you're not gonna build a Section 8
If you don't
apartment
build
complex
I
in
can
Beverly
rent out
Hills.
a condo or any of my
Well,
houses.
okay, like,
Probably cluster.
so this is, I guess, a question, right? Wait, okay, so what would happen if a landlord did, right? Let's say somebody built one and offered it, right? So would you get tenants?
Yes, you would get tenants. You would probably not be profitable.
How can you?
So I guess, right,
Yeah, that's what I'm.
Because
Yeah.
the cost of your land in like the cost of property in those dark neighborhoods, a house in those dark neighborhoods is gonna be more expensive than a house.
well,
in
and this,
those
so
red
it's true in the funny sense, right? I mean, those housing vouchers only go so far, right?
Right.
So like, if you're like basically have no money, and my Section 8 is going to pay $1,200. Well, that doesn't get me anything in Beverly
Right,
Hills.
I'm talking from the landlord position.
Yeah,
From
yeah,
the
yeah.
Developer position.
Right.
The developers are more likely to build in low-income neighborhoods because it's lower cost.
Now, this is important though, right? Is red or the red low-income neighborhoods? Not necessarily, right? They're not necessarily low-income neighborhoods. They're low mobility neighborhoods, but that's not the same as low income. All right, I'll show you. That's this.
That's what this is. I thought that's what the.
That's this chart, right? So, sorry, that's this chart. So this is in Seattle, right? This is rent, and this is mobility, right? So you can see there's there's a connection, right? The higher rent neighborhoods are like a little better at mobility. No, but this is not very strong, right? So, right, this is a very expensive neighborhood, and mobility is terrible. And this is an uber cheap neighborhood, and mobility is good. So I think you're right. So let me back up. So I think you're right, Will. So you're right. If it's a high rent neighborhood, you're not going to get the Section 8 isn't going to work because the voucher isn't enough for right. I mean, you don't have right. I can take my $1,200 voucher, but I don't have another $2,000 to afford the $3,200 to get my studio in Beverly Hills.
Right.
Right.
The homes
So that's
have
not going
be
to
at-
work.
The homes have to be at a fair market rate.
Yeah.
And if that's not a fair market rate, then you're not going to be getting Section 8 housing.
But I think right. So this is I think the point. This is the point that we want to make here, right? The Central District is more expensive than Normandy Park in Seattle, right? Central District is more expensive than Normandy Park. Central District is terrible for mobility. Normandy Park is very good for mobility, right? There are a bunch of Section 8 people in Central District and not as many in Normandy Park, right? So they could get a cheaper rent in Normandy Park, get all these better mobility outcomes, right?
How do you see that in the data? It looks like, to me, there's just as much above the line, below the line, I don't know.
So like, okay, so if you grow up in Normandy Park, right? So for $1,000, like for $1,100, you grow up in Normandy Park, you make like 43,
Yep.
right? For $1,400, you can grow up in Central District and make 30,
Yep.
right? But you're right. So I mean, I'm still with you on this though, in that, right? If landlords could build housing targeting Section 8 and the people wanted to come and the numbers penciled out, they would do it, right? So there's probably something going on with but I wonder though if the thing that going on is right, maybe we just don't want to live in Normandy Park, and so it doesn't make sense to build Section 8 because no one would show up. But I don't know, right? So that would be, do you want to dig into that? Yeah. Let's see. So this is maybe. So here we go. This is just one kind of last fun little fact. So this is, again, you're a 0%er versus a 90%er. These are two different cities, right? So this is Charlotte, and this is Salt Lake. Okay, so why does that matter? Because right, so people might make the argument, well, right, if you take people out of rough neighborhoods and put them in fancy neighborhoods, those kids do great, but then all the other kids are, like influenced negatively by the poverty culture they bring with them, and it all washes out on average in the end or something, right? So this, it would be, right, so Salt Lake would be the kind of city where we know where there's a lot of good income mobility, right, in Salt Lake. And so you can see, right, for people growing up in poverty in Salt Lake, they do much better than people growing up in poverty in Charlotte. But as you go up into the higher income ranges, right, it is not the case that Charlotte then passes Salt Lake, right? So it's right, because I guess if mixing was causing problems, then you would see Charlotte being above Salt Lake because Salt Lake was all mixed with, right, the fact that we have this income mobility. Anyway, so that doesn't appear to be true in the data. But it's still right. It's still true, right? I mean, it has to be right that if you took every last person in an entire neighborhood and put them somewhere else, it's very unlikely that would make much of a difference, right? Right there. I mean, to some degree, and it also fits with the other things that matter, like the sort of the mixing, right? That we're interacting that we have a middle class and we have low segregation and stuff. That seems to do a lot. And so the moving people out of the low mobility neighborhoods into high mobility neighborhoods creates lots of mixing and then brings up. Right. So let's think about right. So yeah, then that's probably yep. Okay, wait. I had one final thing I want to say, but I don't remember what it was. Let's see. Oh, so this is moving, right? So there's a limit probably to how much we can just move people to fix stuff, right? So it would also be nice to be able to take the neighborhoods where people are and improve those things that we're looking at, right? So for example, I mean, I think we were talking about like Winona, right? That the city is built with this railroad track that divides things, and that's like a design decision that could lead to segregation because of the physical separation, right? I mean, I saw it in Houston for sure because the light rail has these chains, so you can't walk across the light rail for a lot of the light rail track. And there was a bunch of fancy development on this side, and there it was like really, sort of run down on the other side. And it was like they did it on purpose. They put up the chains in the parts where they wanted to keep things separate. And that's the kind of, right, so you could take the chains down, and that would be, a way to sort of, not be causing these problems deliberately.
So that whole, like, they grew up on the other side of the tracks is still a true tenet.
Yeah. And you can see, right, you can totally see it.
In Winona and in Houston.
Yes. Yes. And often you can, I mean, and you can definitely see it sometimes in, in ethnic diversity data, right, where you see like these, if it's like a double lane road with a big median in it, it'll create barriers to racial mixing. Yeah. So, and this is also important, right? So, this is right how much so this is explaining my ultimate success based on the poverty level of my environment and those next to me, right? So being in poverty in my immediate environment has a strong effect. Having a neighboring neighborhood that has poverty is basically useless for explaining anything, right? So another way to say it is it's really your immediate environment that dictates what your ultimate adult outcomes will be, not something distant, right? So if you grow up let's imagine you have a little patch of heaven surrounded by a bunch of dangerous nonsense. According to this data, you're going to be okay, right? Your immediate environment isn't what matters. It's not the surrounding stuff, for good or bad, right? So if you live in a really rough patch surrounded by nice stuff, that's not going to work either, right? So you're going to get bad outcomes. So yeah. So then the question is, okay, knowing these facts, what do we do about it? And that's ongoing area of research. But one final fascinating thing I think from this, right? If you think about housing vouchers, how they currently work, often it's a wait list, right? So you apply and then you wait, and once the wait list, once you get to your spot, then you get your voucher, right? So that's like the exact opposite of what we should be doing, right? Because it means that the vouchers all go to older kids, right? We want the reverse, right? You should be too old to get a voucher, and we give it right away to people who have like little kids, right? So that's just a rule change you could do that from the data would have a huge effect, right? And it's not like either political party would be super committed to wait lists, right? It's hard to see how putting people on a wait list is like a Democrat-Republican issue, right? I don't know. You never know. It seems like we can turn a lot of things into partisan issues. Yeah, they can figure it out.
And not allow railroad tracks.
Right. Yeah, if you can't walk through it. Right. Yes, these are solutions that are wacky enough to not necessarily poke people's buttons. I don't know, maybe. Okay, well, right, thank you for hanging for this stuff for the 4 hours that we did. And we're back in here in 2 weeks, right? So we have an online week, then we're back in here in 2 weeks. And we will spend some time at that point talking. You can talking a little bit about your empirical project number one.
Are you willing, I mean, I know you said email is the best way to get a hold of you, because you try to get a couple of them daily. If we have concerns as we're doing our project reports too, I mean, are you willing to potentially not say right around, but at least, you know, give us feedback on if we're on the right track, maybe, what you,
Yes. No. So I would say right. So let's say you're halfway in and you just want to know, like, am I crazy or whatever, right? Am I way off? You're save me before I. Yeah. I would. Yeah. So I would call me probably would be best. I mean, you can email me and say, here's what it is. Take a look at it. But probably even better maybe would be email me and then call me and say, hey, I just sent you an email. Can we look at it together? That would be the best way to do it.
and is it okay if it's kind of like out the looks in your office hours there, but are you willing? I mean, obviously we're not gonna do like midnight or anything. But
Yeah. No, my office hours for this class are as arranged. So you basically just find. Well, okay, this class is literally the only thing I'm doing right now. So like we had 10-year accreditation paperwork that is like turned in today. So I've been working on that for like literally a year, and it's done.
Wow.
So I'm gonna be hanging out with my kids and making some bread and answering your phone calls. So so yeah.
You're talking about actual bread or like money?
Oh, and no, actual. I made 4 loaves of homemade bread yesterday. I ground my own wheat and everything. It was really good.
How many loaves are left today?
One maybe. It was one when I left at 10 this morning. Yeah, it goes quick.
But there aren't, I mean,
I'm gonna have
there
to
aren't
talk
really
about it.
right or wrong answers. Technically, it's, we're supporting our hypotheses with the data that we,
Yeah.
right?
So
I mean, this isn't a,
thanks so much. We'll see you. Seth, so
it's
if
not
you,
like a
And then the
black
Yeah,
and
okay.
white type of.
Right, so then you'll know.
in a sense, like right. So if you claimed something the opposite of what the data you found,
Right.
that would be wrong.
Right.
But yeah,
But
it's
you're building conclusions based on the information.
yes. And right, and it is possible to tell different stories with the same geography, right?
Right.
So you could say, oh yeah, Reno has these good things for it. I don't know. There's like every town has good and bad aspects that show up in data, probably.
Are you, I was just gonna say, are you looking for, and I'm guessing probably not, because it's more personal based on what we're finding, but I mean, are you looking for us to be able to cite sources to, like, from journals and stuff? Or is it-
Generally no. So
okay, all right.
so I would say this is what you. Here, let me turn off the
that's
recording.
kind of what I was thinking.
What I would say that you might end up citing would be if you went and found